So I'm delighted today to introduce Daniel Hawkins and Jenna Davis, and they're going to take us through some information around sort of asset information and data intelligence in the port sector. And this is it's an interesting sector for the Institute. We've got a number of different ports authorities around the world who are engaged and involved with us, so it'd be really interesting. I just want to point out that Daniel was shortlisted for one of our Next Gen awards as well. So this is just a great opportunity for our Next Gen community to sort of engage and involved and give the opportunity to talk to everyone about the work they're involved with. And you might have noticed that he also had a little article in the latest Assets magazine. So do check out the Assets magazine as well, because you'll see some of the other people who were shortlisted and are the winners as well. So now I'll hand over to Daniel and Jenna, and if you can just introduce yourself, and we'll handle questions at the end. Just as a reminder, please put questions in the questions tab. If you want to drop anything into chat, please do that as well, but please put questions in the questions tab. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are. A bit of an introduction then. So I work for KPMG with Jenna in what we call the government and infrastructure team, but have come up through sort of an engineering academic background, a little bit of work in the engineering space, and then jumped into PwC in the KPMG world of consulting, turning my engineering into analytics, business intelligence as they call it, particularly with PwC. And then since working with Jenna as a bit of a asset management guru and mentor, I started turning business intelligence into asset intelligence. So that's kind of where I've come from and where I am today. Jenna, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hi, thanks, Daniel. So my name's Jenna Davis, and I work with Daniel in the KPMG Infrastructure and Government team. I'm based in Dublin, whereas Daniel's based in our Belfast office. I started my career for about 12 years with Network Rail, went through the graduate scheme, and obviously asset management was something that was ingrained in us from the very beginning, which was great because it came from the top. So I've been involved in the IAM probably since about 2010, when we first did the Orbis program within Network Rail, which was introducing technology, mobile phones, apps, all that sort of stuff. Seems all very normal these days. I then went to the States with Network Rail Consulting for 3 years and was advising railway companies there on their asset management techniques. And following that, I joined KPMG in London and moved across to the Irish firm. In their asset management team originally in London, and work with clients on their asset investment plans, asset management strategies, and also embedding asset management into sort of organizational transformations and reorgs. So that's me, and I'll hand over back to Daniel now, who will take you through what we're going to talk about.
So had our introduction. We're going to talk to you today about ports and asset intelligence. Ports sort of in the contextual lens, what are ports, what is their role, what assets do they have, and then asset intelligence is going to talk a little bit more conceptually. As consultants, we work with a lot of companies in different ways, and I feel the tenets of asset intelligence are very similar to other analytical processes, and it's often overlooked. So I'd like to frame that how I interpret asset intelligence, and then hopefully that's something you can take away. And then we'll come back to ports and look at what we did specifically with our clients. So the port context. Ports are really exciting places, and I feel the general population doesn't realize how exciting they are. And they're really important. It's not a place where boats park and ships come in and they give coal or resources. You don't have ferries docking. They're so much more important. They are like micro cities that also contribute to their local society. And I think to put that into context, this is my local port, Belfast Harbour, local to the extent I actually live in the harbour area. And I just wanted to sort of really show off how important they are to the local society. They have film studios, they have their own police station, They host an airport, entertainment complexes, residential, commercial property is obviously a big thing in the ports with that access, especially in Northern Ireland, given its sort of new political options in terms of access to the EU and the UK markets. So commercials are becoming a big thing here, and sort of heritage. So ports are really exciting places, I think, more than we necessarily realise. Being an asset management talk, I'd be remiss to not talk about some of the specific assets that we have seen in our work with the ports. The big classes that we have are on screen, the cranes, which obviously interact with the ships and pull freight or some sort of material off the ships, with the grabs. So lots of different grabs out there depending on what you're retrieving. Pilot boats, they are something that guide ships in, because fun facts, when a ship comes into a port or goes through a big canal, like the Panama Canal, they don't guide themselves. They have special local pilots who will steer the ship and make sure, because they know the water, they know the ways of the ports a bit better, and the pilot boats support that. Hoppers, I like to think of them as big funnels. So you pick your stuff up with the crane, you want to put it in a lorry, and it's a bit of a messy process. So we have a lovely funnel to redirect that offload, and then ramps where you have vehicles. So if any of you have taken a ferry to the mainland Europe or something like that, you'll have driven over a ramp, I'm sure. So those are some of the major assets and some of the major asset classes that we have been dealing with in support of our clients. And there's so much more to it. These are, in my mind, the key operational assets, but there are a vast majority of things, everything from the lights to the buildings to the road infrastructure, everything can be considered an asset. In terms of organizational structures that we see in the ports, every port's going to be different, and they're all going to organize themselves differently. But some key sort of functions that we have seen and we know exist in other ports are your sort of operations environment. So they're who control who are the ships, what they bringing, who are our customers. They direct traffic. Your harbour master, who quite literally directs the flow of traffic through the port, it will sit in that function. I've got operational engineering here and facilities management as two separate entities that are both really asset management entities. But I split them out because, at least in the work we've done, we find the operations engineering focuses on those operational assets. So those classes that we saw before, whereas facilities management are less operations facing, but more let's keep the lights on, let's keep the port running as it should be. Some other important teams are your IT team, especially in the asset intelligence space. Someone needs to keep those servers online and then tell people off when the analytics is going wrong. And then capital planning, maybe at the sort of front end of your asset life cycle when we're procuring something new or designing some new asset need. Capital planning has a major role, and they all link with the executive team. So these are important structures. This is not everything. You have so much more going on there, but these guys will come up a couple of times across the presentation. So that was a brief introduction to ports generally. What we're going to move into now is Jenna's going to talk about the program with our client recently that we've delivered. So I'll let you talk about what we've been working on, Jenna.
Yeah, sure. So we had the opportunity to work with Belfast Harbour, who had recognised that they needed to just make some improvements to how they were managing their assets. And in the same way that Daniel's kind of given the context of the organisation, they're one part of the wider port operations. So we were working with the operations engineering function, who have responsibility for particular asset classes, the ones that Daniel has gone through being the main ones: the cranes, the hoppers, the pilot boats, the ramps, and the grabs. The grabs have been quite interesting because they actually, are interchangeable and movable across ports. The other assets tend to be fixed assets, except for the pilot boats, but when they are sort of parked up, they are fixed to a certain extent. So we started off with them just asking us to come in and just doing a maturity assessment against the IAM 6-box model as it was then, and the 39 subjects. And that was a really good way to have the conversation about what they're doing well, but what they need to work on. And from that, we developed what we called the Asset Management Improvement Program that's been running for close to sort of 2 years at this point. And parts of that was looking at the quick wins. So what can we do really quickly to improve sort of incident management, how they structure their jobs, how they sign off and do their planning processes. So really sort of fundamental aspects. And one of the core kind of the root causes of some of their issues were actually they procured Maximo maybe 4 or 5 years previously, I think 2018, and they hadn't made that step change in terms of their business processes to support that type of tool. So they were spending a lot of time sort of saying that Maximo doesn't do this, doesn't do that. And obviously Maximo will only do what you have designed it to do. So this is where a lot of the work that Daniel will go through has come from, around the asset intelligence and sort of developing EAM processes essentially for managing Maximo and for what it currently doesn't do. So phase one was very much about what we can do to improve current productivity, response to incidents, and we saw a huge improvement throughout the team. That we did a bit of a restructure of the team, made it more asset aligned. So they have asset engineers and asset managers, and we also kind of brought the technical team more into the everyday management. So they're a much more cohesive department now. And then that's led into phase two, where we were looking at resilience plans for their critical assets, refining some of their corrective maintenance processes. So we'd really locked down the planning processes, but the kind of now, right, where do we how do you define what's the corrective maintenance tasks that need to be inputted into the EAM tool or Maximo, and then how do you prioritize it? So priority codes, and also we kind of took one of the asset classes, the hoppers, and developed an asset class management plan as a template, so that we're upskilling the Belfast Harbour team. So they've now taken that forward and they're developing their asset class management plans for their other assets, which we think is really important. It's that development of sort of asset management capability in organizations. And we've also done some work on their capital management portfolio. So understanding what the progress of the capital programs are, what the handover process is between ops and the capital department, and then we've got ongoing kind of work upcoming with them to continue along the asset management journey. But they've made huge strides in the last 18 months, and it's been really positive, not just from a customer point of view. So their stevedores, and their stevedores being those who manage the cranes and interact with the shippers, have really seen a positive change in terms of the reliability of their assets, the accessibility, the planning, the forward planning. So even they need access to do maintenance on certain ramps and cranes, having that forward plan, having the conversations earlier with the customers is met with support and great enthusiasm. I think they all understand that it's an operational port that needs maintenance. They just need to know when. So I'll hand it back over to Daniel, who can take us through his aspect of it, the asset intelligence piece. Unless, Daniel, sorry, was there a second slide?
Yeah, just talking a little bit about that sort of frustration, and we're going to come into the root cause of this in a bit more detail later. But before we even started working with them, and as a result of the maturity assessment, we identified a frustration with what their implementation on Maximo. And don't worry, I'm not attacking Maximo. We'll get into the details of that in a minute. But complaints about not working, not doing what they wanted it to do, and ultimately we kind of found it was configured poorly. There wasn't necessarily an information strategy. There weren't any standards in place, so they were trying to use a tool that was not fit for purpose, but not its own fault. And that kind of leads into the whole asset intelligence concept that I'm going to talk about for the next 10 minutes or so. because, and we'll come back and review what they could have perhaps done differently to have avoided those problems and avoid that poor configuration later. So you'll see the slide a little bit later again, if it advances. So asset intelligence, before I show you some very detailed slides, I wouldn't get too stuck on terms here. The concepts are important and what those terms represent. So you'll see business intelligence, you'll see business analyst as a role, or an asset manager. Really is thinking about the functions and the process that and the cycle that we go through, and that's what asset intelligence is. So I'll define that a bit more for you. And I originally had in this document called it AI, and then I thought that might get a bit confusing because everything's AI nowadays. So no, asset intelligence is it's about using data. It's about using appropriate analytics to support decisions and solve problems across the asset lifecycle, and that's pretty key. It's not just an operational thing. A lot of our work has centered around operations, but right across the chain, whether it's from at the procurement stage, knowing based on your existing data what you might want to procure, and right through to disposal, there's a role. And when I was developing these slides, I was trying to sort of determine, is asset intelligence a process? Is it a capability, a function? Wasn't sure, and eventually I just decided it's all three. And we'll get into what that means now. So forgive the slightly chaotic screen, I'll go through it. We're talking about asset intelligence as a process. The big takeaway I want anyone watching to understand is it's a requirements-led process. You don't walk in saying, I'm going to get a digital twin, I'm going to implement AI. That's a solution, and that might be an appropriate solution, but until you know what your requirements are, you can't really know. And that's a bit of a sticking point for me generally, where those are the exciting buzzwords we hear in the industry, but making sure that they're not just buzzwords and they're actually appropriate is important. So starting with we'll step through this process, starting with your problem, and your problem might come from anywhere. So I talked through those different sort of groups within the business earlier. Your problem statement, your stakeholder might come from the operations team. We've got a ship of type X delivering cargo Y. Can we interact with it? That might be something you get. Operations engineering might need some performance reports. The exec team probably needs some high level performance reports. Capital guys, we're going to buy a new crane. Are we buying an electric crane, a diesel crane? What existing cranes do we have? So the point here is your problem can come from anywhere, and it's not just within the silo of your asset management team. Once you've identified your problem, you're going to step through stages of refinement and the requirements context of refinement. So you start with a very, very heavily contextualized, business contextualized problem. And your first step is, right, can we put this in terms of our assets? So the business wants X. What does that mean for asset Y? And I've got a very specific example after the slide because I appreciate it might not click first time here. Next step is then, right, okay, I've understood the asset context of the problem. Analytically, what do I need to do? What algorithm do I need to apply? What metric do I need to develop that will respond to that need? And then stepping down once more on the left-hand side here, I should probably use my little arrow to point out where I'm at. It's the specific data requirements. So if I'm producing a mean time between failure analysis, what are the data points that go into that? Well, it's the asset, it's the time, it's the when was there a breakdown, etc. Once you've sort of built out those requirements and those sort of cascading requirements, you can then start thinking about your solution. And it's okay, we'll deliver the data, we'll conduct the analysis, and ultimately we're going to provide an insight that supports the problem statement, whether it's a problem or a decision. But you can't. This just doesn't come out of nowhere. You have to step down that stakeholder requirements, and I think we all know that. I think you could tell anyone in any business, not just in asset management, this concept, and they get it. But I think sometimes we lose track of it, and we can get here and be like, oh, why am I doing this again? What is this supposed to be giving me? So to bottom this out a little bit more, I'll step through an example. Or before I go ahead, Jenna, is there anything you want to add on this concept before I advance? You can shake your head if no, I'll see.
No, I think a lot of the points you're making are sort of really important, because I think we do talk a lot about, you know, the art of the possible, what we want to do, what we want to achieve. And while it might not be what everybody wants to talk about, there's such importance to doing the foundational things correctly and addressing the data management behind the tools, to have the dashboards, to develop the digital twins. And I think that's sort of the responsibility of us as asset managers, to make sure that organizations and infrastructure management managers know that that investment is key. So the terms aren't necessarily the big thing to focus on. It's, do you have people with the right skills to understand, you know, the data management processes, how to share data, and then there's that aspect of all the every individual in these organizations or in these teams really should have their own data management skills, that it's not just a asset intelligence department or an IT department that just does it for you, that you're actively managing and understanding the data that's behind the analytics.
Absolutely. And we'll get a bit more into capability. I said it was a process, a capability, and a function. We'll get into those skills and the capabilities behind them in a little bit more. I want to give you an example. You'll be glad to know it's a port-specific example, because we're really excited about ports. So Lolo, I don't know if anyone on the call is a port aficionado. Lolo is load on, load off. It's a type of interaction with a ship where a crane's involved. You're scooping something, let's say, out of the ship. It's not a truck driving on and then eventually driving off. That would be another type. So business, high-level business, has identified a need. Maybe the operations department. We're going to see an increase in these sort of low interactions. Can we rely on our cranes to actually deliver that new demand? So that's your stakeholder requirement. That's your problem statement. Really contextualized against the business. Is not very aware. It knows it thinks it knows what it wants. It's talking about cranes, but it doesn't really understand cranes. So what we might do is, a person somewhere in this process is going to go, well, I am an expert. I'm an asset management manager. I'm responsible for cranes. I know that when we talk about reliability, can we rely on our crane? Reliability, we're talking uptimes, we're talking about failure metrics, we're talking about frequencies of those and root causes. So I can define some analytical requirements that I need. That are now, I've changed the context from the business context to the asset context. And when I say context, I guess it's just the application of knowledge. Next step is to make a data request. I know I want some uptime algorithm. So ignore the really nonsensical little text you see on the screen here, but I need this data point and that data point, and I need, an amalgamation of those to really meet that request. With your requirements defined, we can think about the solution. So it's okay, I'm going to go into my server, my database, maybe my Maximo or my other EAM. I'm not going to try and show too much bias here, and pull out that data. I'm going to, wrong direction. I'm going to send it up the chain to do some analysis, which here, as you can see, in this hypothetical scenario, uptime is at 95%. When we have issues, that some of the time they're to do with the engine, some of the time they're to do with the cable, but a lot of the time it's actually to do with operator error. That tells us something, but we're still only analysts. We're all data analysts, so we don't really understand what that means yet. And some further sort of mean time between failure numbers here. So you've got your outputs. Now and this is where asset intelligence really comes into its own. It's about finding the value in those outputs. And because you've gone through this process of requirements gathering and making sure you've captured the context you need, you will have the value because you've done the algorithm that you've already identified you needed to do. So we can say from the 95% uptime, it's adequate. It's going to be available. We've noticed that operator error is an issue. So maybe the business analyst or the asset intelligence analyst might go, well, maybe we need to do some operator training. It's identified the solution. And again, maybe we need to add a new maintenance task to support where the mean time between failure is roughly 100 hours. Maybe if we just get a new maintenance task in ahead of that, we can sort of build in resilience. So that's an example, and I've appreciate that it might not be as straightforward as I had intended. So any questions, feel free to throw them in at the end. What we'll talk about now then is the capability, so those skills. And what you'll see in this diagram on the left, and I apologize that there is another diagram, we've taken sort of that chain of stakeholder requirements, analytical requirements, data requirements, and the return, and applied some, I call them functions, not roles, because they're not always people. So you have your stakeholder, you have your asset intelligence team, and you have your data analysts. It's important when you think about the skills that those people have. So your stakeholders, who may have come from operations or the executive team or your own department, they need the business context. They need to understand how business works and how whatever their department needs works. And a little bit of asset knowledge would be helpful. It's the asset intelligence team that really provide that asset context. They make sure that we're pulling the right analysis that will address the business problem. And simultaneously, they need a bit of a sort of understanding of analytics. They need to know what their analytical team is capable of. You know, they can't be plucking random pieces of analysis out of the air saying this will solve all our issues if no one in the team can deliver that. I like to think of these guys as having quite a broad up and down awareness. They really are the link between the functions in the chain. And then ultimately you do have your analysts, who are the people that can do the wacky analysis. They can pull things from the database, they can execute custom code or whatever your context is, or at least click the right buttons on your asset management software. Those are the pretty sort of different skill sets you need across your function. And ultimately it's all of these together that deliver your capability. It's not any one of these. You need someone who understands the business, you need someone who understands the assets, and the person with the knowledge and skill to apply the data analysis that you require. There are some other functions in a sort of business intelligence, asset intelligence model, but I'm not going to focus on them today because time, but feel free to ask later on. An important further observation we need to make is that it's about relationships. There's a big chain going on here of passing down requirements, and communication is a big part of that. Engagement is a big part of that. And I know I've seen it in a lot of organizations where those relationships are not very good. It's, I don't want to talk to that person, or I don't really understand that person. If you can't interact with your stakeholder or your analyst as an asset intelligence function, you're going to struggle, really. So it's a lot about interfacing and understanding. Some final points I'd really like to make are we've identified these functions, and the reason I call them functions again is because it's not people. Your business analyst and your data analyst function, or sorry, I'm using wider terms, your asset intelligence and your data analyst functions might be one person. It's kind of where I like to consider myself as someone who understands asset management a little bit, thanks to Jenna. I'm a good strategic thinker thanks to my role as a consultant, but I've come from an analytical engineering background, so I can do a lot of what I think is quite fun coding and algorithm development and so on. So this isn't distinct roles necessarily. It can be a combination of roles, and it might be multiple people as well. And then another observation to make is that your data analyst function might not be a person at all. It can be your EAM, it can be your Maximos or your alternatives. You know, if any of you have used those tools, you'll know that mean time between failure is just a default function you can develop. Your uptime statistics, they are things you can just pull in implicitly. You don't need to write custom pieces of code or an Excel formula or spreadsheet every time you have a question. Sometimes your tool, if it's configured really well, can give you that capability in advance and fulfill the analytical need. So something to take away and think about. Essentially, it's a holistic capability, and how you deliver it is really, really bespoke to every business. So a lot of conceptual stuff there, and I appreciate it's quite detailed, so please interrogate at the end of this session with your questions. We'll link it back to the ports, as that's sort of the main theme of today. We saw this earlier, and that frustration with the EAM tool in Belfast Harbour, and having applied this sort of asset intelligence mentality in reviewing, we realized perhaps the tool wasn't the problem, it was the process of procuring it. The requirements weren't quite captured. What does the business need is the first question. What are the capabilities of our tool that we need to meet the business need is the next question as we step down that hierarchy. And I think possibly those questions weren't asked quite as well as they could have been at the outset, and that's what led to a non-ideal configuration. and ultimately a lot of frustration in the team and a lack of capability. Further points to make: they did not have a very strong, as I say, data management. I said data analyst, but it's more about making sure that your data is being captured in the right format. It's, you can trust it. They didn't really have a role or a person fulfilling that. So I think there was a lot of gaps in the system we found, or just, oh, I don't know what the answer is here, so I'm just going to categorize my data as this and make it someone else's problem. Then finally, it's a lifecycle process and requires leadership, strategy, standards, and controls. By not having a very detailed asset strategy or an information strategy or standards, really, it was difficult for them to ever procure quite the perfect solution. So that's an interesting finding that we found in our work. Yeah. And in terms of a little bit of extra stuff that we did, so they had challenges with the Maximo. All well and good us kind of understanding why it wasn't quite what they needed it to be, but they had problems. They need to resolve them then and there. So we actually, as part of that phase 1, had the quick wins, and that's where we started thinking about solutions. So build what I call the mini Maximo, but I guess a mini EAM tool, taking out some of those key functionalities that Maximo can do, but it wasn't configured to do for their assets. And we sort of did a sort of Excel and Power BI combination as something, and I feel like in this modern world, we're all quite knowledgeable in Excel at this point. So something more comfortable with the team skill set helped them connect with their data and sort of bring them back down to the foundations, as Jenna pointed out earlier. We redesigned some processes and roles so that they had that capability. So they now have asset managers, the people that think in the asset context, and I think they even have a head engineer who is connecting them to the business and making sure that requirement is getting captured. So I guess vertical integration is a buzzword that wants to come into my head. So Jenna did a lot of work around that. And then by delivering this Power BI Excel tool, it meant we could sort of take Maximo offline, not actually, but kind of offline, not make it a priority for them, which meant we can reconfigure it and do some parallel operations so that it can eventually come back online and replace this tool. So that's some of the specific work we did. Feel free to ask some specific questions, because I think that's really the end of the presentation. Yeah, Q&A. So Ursula, I don't know if you're going to pop back up and manage the questions for us. Not much of a warning for you there. Apologies.
No, it's fine. No worries at all. We've had a load of questions in, actually. So I'm gonna answer them in the order they came in, rather than jump around, if that's okay.
Good.
So the first question, and I've already answered the question that the session will be recorded. So for anyone who wants to watch it again or wants to pick up on any items and go back, the session will be recorded and we will make that available. It usually takes us a few days just to get it downloaded, and we just do a little bit of just tidying up, and then we get it out on the website. So it will be available. We've been asked about whether the slides will be shared. That is completely up to you, Daniel and Jenna. If you want to make the slides available, we can make that available with the recording. But if you don't, obviously everyone does have the slides as part of the recording, so it's up to you. But there's no need to answer that now. We can pick that up afterwards.
That's good.
Yeah, let's get on to some questions. So Mark Knight, who's joined us from the US, I said that we got some people who were joining us from the East Coast, because it's just it's their morning, obviously. So you listed MTBF as a measure of reliability, but did you incorporate MTTR as part of your criticality assessment? So this is sort of getting into the sort of specifics of the reliability.
Mean time to failure was one that they used. We were more concerned with response times to failures when incidents happened. There's probably an older portfolio of assets that really weren't fit for purpose in terms of reliability. and they have a investment program for newer assets like cranes, and they were rolling out telemetry retrofits that would enable that metric to be more measured. They just didn't have the data really to do any meaningful analysis on MTBR.
Okay.
I'll add, I think a lot of the time I installed capability and we had to step away and say, right now, guys, go gather data for 8 weeks so that we can actually use these
Okay.
metrics. Um,
so this is a question from Yogini Gahani, and Yogini is a regular poster of questions on our IM discussion forum. So if you want to see any of the stuff that's been posted there, it's well worth going on to the discussion forum. And he often poses questions to our asset management community, and this is another such question actually. It's that, do you suggest to have an asset data analyst in an asset management team?
I think the point is the capability has to exist somewhere. So how you want to deliver that is whether it's a team in your team. I've seen it personally where businesses had, even our own company actually, KPMG, we have sort of center of excellence. They're sort of like a siloed departments that you can call on anytime you need that data analytical capability. So I really couldn't say without knowing more. I need to gather some of those stakeholder requirements first, but it's a possibility, yeah. And quite common in a smaller asset management organization. You would just have your resident analyst who is called on at every time.
But
Yeah, I
think
think
it's
the other
fair.
aspect of it,
Sorry,
sorry,
Jenna.
Marissa, I think the
No,
other aspect is developing teams that have complementary skills. So having somebody who's more on the kind of asset data analytical side with people with more practical, it's kind of that maturity, but there's no one size fits all.
that was broadly what I was going to say. I think it's about people working together, isn't it? However the organizational structure is, it's about that working together. The next question is really comes back to the point you were just making, actually, Daniel, about data quality. When Mark had asked the question specifically about MTBF, and it comes from Nicholas Lee, and he said, "Did you face any data quality issues when you were trying to answer the problem statements? If so, how did you overcome them? And were the issues more system related or people related?"
The ending of that question suggests that whoever asked that is very aware. People oriented quite often. So we did encounter quality issues, and I guess there's a difference between integrity and quality, and I'm sure there are other definitions out there. There's gaps, and then there's the data being wrong, and then there's the data being misinterpreted, and they're all kind of falls into that area of quality. What I think we encountered is perhaps misinterpretation a lot. I've got, when we talk about maintenance tasks or something, this one is of priority 1, this one's a priority 2. I think different people in the organization, and that's just an input into your system, like that's a number in a database. Person X thought that meant, okay, this one needs to be done within a couple of days, and then the next person thought that meant, oh, I have 5 days to get that done. Different tolerance. That's the kind of challenge we encountered, I think it'd be fair to say, Jenna. And it was really sort of, okay, well, it's not even a tool, that's not even an analytical solution. This is, let's go and define those things in some sort of information strategy. And then I want to say educate. These people are very knowledgeable people, so educate seems a harsh word, but just remind them that they need to be on board with each other and come back to an information strategy when they have those sort of quality questions. In terms of data gaps, I think they were there implicit in most organizations that I've experienced. It's just a matter of finding ways to resolve those. Jenna?
Yeah, I think one of the key things is a lot of the tools. So Maximo was free text. So the follow-on work to a lot of this around defining what corrective maintenance tasks were, what their priorities were to get some rigor to what people were defining. A lot of things were very subjective, so it was very hard to do kind of analytics. Now, Daniel did a lot of analytics behind the scenes, but it was very labor intensive, and it's not, it's a human that's required to do it. So to have that intelligence coming through the systems, you need to have the defined sort of data definitions and management of data quality. And again, that is an education piece of the team, and we had seen good progress in terms of using the same terms, the same rigor, applying the same priorities, but it also allowed for the planning meetings to be a lot more robust, where people would be like, well, why are we planning to do this one when actually I don't think it's that much of a priority? And that was based on the assessments made. So again, it was making sure that people understood that it's a tool. If you're doing an assessment or an inspection and you're saying that something is a priority one, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't have the conversation about what it means in the wider context of the whole work portfolio, and maybe it goes further down the list and there's some mitigation put in. So it really, the data quality is such an important aspect that actually encourages maturity of the organization and the team. So we saw incremental improvement, but there's always further improvement that can be made.
And we've got a related question here, which is to do with data quality. So it's our colleague Gahini again, and he said, great insights. A question about data quality. We have a CMS system, but sadly data quality is poor. What can we do to improve the data quality over a period? Any tactical initiatives we can put in place? So I think it's just really trying to get into those tactical initiatives.
Yeah, just to confirm, I'm presuming CMMS is Corrective Maintenance Management System, which would be very similar to aspects of Maximo. So the biggest thing is categorizing your maintenance types and then having that assigned to the different asset types. So again, what's behind all this? Asset class management plans, asset management strategies to really drive the definition of what your corrective maintenance requirements are. And I think one of the biggest things that I would say is useful when tackling it is that you start with a small, broad category of items and you develop a longer list as you get more information. So I always use the example of there's an alien on the track, is a very odd, unusual maintenance task that you need to respond to. So until you have 17 or 100 aliens regularly going on track, you would just have it under the category of object online. So it's kind of having a catch-all to understand what the detail is when you're developing out what the different corrective maintenance tasks need to be. Now, a lot of them can be derived initially from the standards. That's your starting point. But again, the more you actually get the repetitive data through the system, so say you have 5 core categories of corrective maintenance, you are asking then for certain details within those. So if it's a broken lever arm, well then you're asking them to define, well, how is it broken? And then when you're seeing that there's a crack or it's severed or it's jammed, you would then layer in, well, this is the type of failure now, and there's a separate corrective action towards it. So it's kind of building up that intelligence over time and knowing that it's a continuous learning process.
Thank you.
Can I just add as well, I think we found, for example, in your phase 2, Jenna, in terms of tactical solutions, let's, rather than lots of issues, let's shrink them, let's reduce them, let's focus on one asset class. So I think we looked at hoppers, and we built an information strategy, well, an asset strategy, then an information strategy around that then the team can take away and expand. And hoppers were a priority asset class. So it just so happened that the way they structured their company and the way they structured their assets, we had that lovely class to go in, and that was the urgent one. So that might be a tactical option for you, but really it all comes down to your unique scenario.
Thank you. We've got another question from Mark Knight and he said, while ports are indeed like mini cities, their main purpose is to move cargo. How did you focus on dwell time to improve operations with asset intelligence?
Dwell time of ships, I'm assuming, in harbour. I don't think that was something we specifically looked at, if I'm honest.
So again, it's kind of the structure of the organization. So each port will be set up differently. So Belfast Harbour operations don't deal directly with the ships. That is managed by the harbour master, which was a separate is a separate part of the organisation. The logistics, the on the ground operations, deal with the stevedores, who are they manage the kind of onloading, offloading of the ships. So we weren't getting involved in dwell time, but what we were sort of cognizant of was when we were dealing with the ramps. They are relied upon for the onloading, offloading. They are very dependent on the shipping times, and actually that's where the forward planning comes from. So though if those fail, it has a direct impact on the day's operations that can have knock-on effects for weeks. So again, it was prioritizing the maintenance requirements around that, and then putting a business case to why they needed access at a particular time based on, we have seen these amount of failures and incidents. If we are allowed to do this amount of work with this amount of disruption, we will avoid all this disruption. So that's probably was our main interaction with dwell times, and it was really around stakeholder engagement and communication of required maintenance plans in the future.
Thank you. We have a question from Alex Rutter, and it's really around your usage of the 6-box model and potentially some of the other IAM tools. So did you spend time operating using the IAM 6-box model for some time before realizing you needed more, i.e. the 10-box model? And associated question, did you use the IAM's self-assessment methodology plus to determine you were at level 3 ready to move up? So it's really a question around some of the tools I think you used, and relating to some of the IAM tools.
Yeah, just briefly, I'll touch on that. So KPMG doesn't, in Ireland, doesn't do accreditation, and it was quite what I would describe a quick and dirty assessment. We were in there for 2 weeks and turned around kind of an assessment. So what we utilized was sort of a RAG status, red, amber, green, against the 6-box model and the 39 subjects, which allowed us to have the conversations about the areas that they needed to focus on in a really productive way, because it can be quite harsh to hear that you're not good at certain elements. So I think having that spectrum approach, the 10-box model, we actually decided not to introduce it as a concept at this stage because we were very much upskilling and introducing asset management as a concept, and I found the 6-box model is still very robust to get your head around, and does deal with all the key issues that an engineering operations team would need. As and when we're having a broader conversation with the wider organization, we would introduce the 10-box model because there's more aspects to it. But essentially, we followed the standards of the IAM, and but we didn't do a sort of specific assessment, and we were very very clear about that because we weren't following the full methodology. They really needed to understand where their problems were quickly and have a plan in place. So it was great to have the framework to use, but we weren't that rigorous with it.
Thank you. The next question is around how did you overcome the poor Maximo configuration? I think you actually qualified that this wasn't necessarily Maximo, but more about how it been utilized and some of those things, Daniel. So maybe you want to pick up this question.
Yeah, so in the process, we took it offline, and then put those temporary tools in place and making configurations. I guess it was, I'm trying to do it in a way that's succinct and you don't have to know everything about the way the ports worked, but Maximo was being hosted by their IT team, even though the operations team kind of own it as a tool and a capability. So it was a matter of, once we'd taken it offline effectively, it was, here are the big changes. Let's wrap these as a change request, I'm going to call it. Have a little bit of a back and forth with the IT team, and then they'll make those changes. And I think they had a sort of internal support that could reconfigure some of the databases in the back end. An example would be, I talked earlier about prioritization of maintenance tasks. I think we requested the addition of a new sort of field in the database that sits behind Maximo, and we identified the need with the client, made the request to the IT team, they had it implemented, and then we made sure it was working as intended. So it was changes like that we took across, but I think it's a process of, whenever you make changes to a big system like that, you have to take them kind of one at a time a little bit, and they're not necessarily the most, if we talk about software and Maximo as a software or any EM as a software, they're not an organization necessarily familiar with some of the more recent approaches to software development. So like Agile, which anyone may have heard of, and cyclical arrangement of your sort of task orders. That wasn't necessarily something they were comfortable with. So we had to sort of use a traditional, we'll do this, then we'll do this, then we'll do this, and we'll plan at the beginning. So hopefully that answers the question.
I'm going to just jump a little bit with the questions, because there's some people who've asked questions who we haven't managed to get to, and so I'm trying to just share out the questioners really to some extent. Yeah. David Capling has asked a question, which is really a cracking question about sort of culture. So how have these asset intelligence principles been embedded culturally in the team to empower them to continue your approach once you've sort of finished your work and you sort of move on, which is always a really cracking question we find in any implementation anywhere, really.
Behavior change. In terms of how we did it, I'll come to it in a second, and maybe Jenna can help me with that. More, I'm thinking of our process improvement manager, our favorite person in the organization, and in response to the behavior changes that we sort of did try and instill on the company, we've seen them adopt this way of thinking, where quite recently, and in an ongoing way, the person responsible for their I don't want to name them just in case, their metric reporting has come back to me since conclusion of a lot of our work and said, those dashboards, that Power BI or the presentation you helped us develop was really good, but actually we found over the last 9 months that metric that we thought we needed isn't really telling us anything more, because we've fixed that problem. Can you help us with a new metric? And then every couple of months it's we've changed. And that mentality of acknowledging that you don't need to report something for reporting's sake. If it's no longer adding value, let's either delete it. If a maintenance task isn't actually maintaining an asset, you're not going to keep doing it. It's a waste of time, waste of effort and resourcing. So we've seen that mentality change. In terms of how you encourage that change in an organization, it's showing, I think at the end of our initial assessment and our maturity assessment, the slides you saw around the process on requirements and a very much older version of that diagram was what we sort of took the team through and stepped them through that approach. And I guess a few people, it just clicked with a few people, and we just kept reminding them that start with your requirements, then deliver your solution. And that's how we saw that change. So I personally have definitely seen that mentality shift, which is great.
Yeah, I think one of the key things was transparency, and also combining the team as a real team. So there was a real workshop kind of office divide before, but actually sharing the data, putting in planning processes, having joint meetings with the whole team, the technicians and the what are now asset managers, really changed how they worked as a team, but also that people felt very involved in decisions. And I think that's one of the core aspects of mature asset management response, is that you are engaging at all levels of the business, and everybody's working towards the same goal and same strategy. So I think in particular we got really good feedback from some of the lead technicians, who now just feel like they're much more involved with the decision making, understanding the why, and they're much more capable of going and explaining that to the people who need to do the work on the ground.
You showed them the benefit of the work. You showed them what they were doing and why it was valuable. If you just say, go and collect that data, go and collect that data week in, week out, and they never see why, they're not going to enjoy it. They're not going to respect it. So I think that's what Jenna showed them.
We've got probably this probably be the last question. There are a few other questions, and I will send those on to Daniel and Jenna. I apologise because it's hailing where I am, and it's quite noisy. So if you can hear some background noise, I can't do anything about it whilst I'm speaking. But you both described how you can mobilise the data analyst capability. Do you think there's a place for a business analyst to remain within the asset management space until the organisation can think asset management across the silos? And that's from Simon Hutchison.
Yeah. If I actually got my slides here, haven't I? I'm going to jump back to that little structure. So interesting you say business analyst, because that's almost what I characterize myself as in day-to-day world. And I put this here intentionally to show anyone who's not thinking in the asset management space, but broadly across their business. I have, in this diagram, suggested that your business analyst is your asset intelligence capability. I think the question almost suggests that it's not, and it's a separate function, maybe something that sits between assets and stakeholders. I guess that role or function needs to stay where your asset management team are not connecting to the business. Again, like the point we just made, if they don't understand why they're doing something and why the business wants it, they're going to struggle to be motivated to do that thing. So why am I making sure that this crane is more reliable? I don't care. It works when it needs to work. So why back to that example earlier. So you need that capability, and I guess you can lose that role if it's a specific individual's role when the team understands that and they're more vertically integrated with the stakeholders. Again, it's not about having this row and this row and this row. It's about having the whole thing, and how you deliver that is very much, and the mutual capabilities is very much up to your organization.
Yeah, just last point on that is I suppose there's a benefit to having within the team and outsourcing it. So Daniel's essentially been on a retainer as a business analyst for the team for the last sort of 18 months. There's a benefit from having an outsider view as well. I think again it's constantly revisiting it and asking the question, and as and when you have enough rationale to have it in-house, it should be in-house. But again, it's not necessarily has to be an individual role. It can be a person with that capability, and it's part of their job role to sort of do the business analytics element as well.
I think what we'll do is we'll pause there because we really are now at the top of the hour, and we've already exceeded our time by a quarter of an hour. But we've got a few questions which we will definitely pass on to Daniel and Jenna, and we'll see we get those answered for everyone. But I wanted to say a massive thank you for Daniel and Jenna for joining us today and sharing a really interesting example of how sort of asset intelligence and data analysis and how it all comes together for a real life application in ports. So thank you everyone for joining. We have recorded the session, so it will be available in a few days, and we'll make sure that comes out on LinkedIn. So if you do want to catch up with it again, it will be available on the website, and we'll be advertising it on LinkedIn. And I will also follow up with Daniel and Jenna about these slides. So thank you everyone.
Thank you for watching.
Thanks so much, Ursula.